and thank you for coming this afternoon and attending the next plenary speech. It is my delight and pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Christina Gkonou. She has been a huge influence in my research, and I met her at the TD Teachers Journey Conference 2 years ago. And since then, I was hoping to find a way to bring her to JALT, and she kindly agreed to be a plenary for us tonight. And she is an associate professor of TESOL and the MA TESOL program leader in the Department of Language and Linguistics at the University of Essex in the UK. And she is co-editor of multiple books, New Directions in Language Learning Psychology, New Insights into Language Anxiety, Theory, Research, and Educational Implications, and The Emotional Roller Coaster of Language Teaching. And she's also written multiple articles and peer-reviewed journals, and she has a new book coming out with Cambridge University Press on cultivating teacher well-being, and it will be out this coming March. So today she's here to share with us about reflections and new perspectives on language teacher emotions, and it is my delight and pleasure to again welcome Christina. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for your kind words. Thank you for the invitation. It has been a pleasure to interact with you this time before the JALT conference and now during the actual conference. Thank you everyone for being here, for joining this session. I will start by sharing my screen, and I hope we have tried it before and it worked great. So I hope there won't be any issues now. Okay, here it is. Let me just sort out all the different windows on the screens I have in front of me. Right. Okay. So what I will try to do in today's plenary is to share my reflections and some ideas I have for new perspectives or new directions in language teacher emotion research and practice. I have divided this presentation into two parts, actually. And here is the outline. So I have tried to think in terms of reflections and new perspectives, which is actually the focus of this year's conference. So in terms of reflections, I will share with you what we already know about language teacher emotions. It was difficult to actually put everything in this plenary because there are different things that I would like to touch upon. So I am going to share what I think we already know about language teacher emotions by trying to address as many different areas of knowledge as possible. And then I will share with you my reflections on what it is that we still don't know about language teacher emotions, or some research has taken place on these things, on these areas, but still there is so much that we need to learn. So this is in terms of reflections, and then in terms of new perspectives, which is the second theme or the second focus of the conference, I will go through what we could possibly do in terms of teacher education and research. So I will try to bring together what we still don't know about language teacher emotions with what we can do about that, how we can, in a way, fill this gap in terms of both teacher education and in terms of research. Okay, so I will start by sharing some quotes, and these quotes come from different sources. They come from books, already published research, they come from other forms of media, and one or two things that participants in my research have said, and I am using them to share with you different insights that we already have about emotions. And I like the fact that these quotes, these ideas come from different types of sources, and I hope that they will encourage you to think about emotions as well. Right. I start with a quote by Ledoux, who has done a lot of work on emotions in general, not emotions in language learning and teaching, which is basically our field. However, the work has been influential, and I like this particular quote, which goes like, our minds have thoughts as well as emotions, and the study of either without the other will never be fully satisfying. And this is what the photo at the bottom actually shows. What we basically see is a heart and a mind, the brain, that are holding hands, and they are walking together. And this is a useful way to actually understand or visualize the relationship between the heart and the mind, or emotions and thoughts, feelings and thinking. And it is important to actually consider both in our understanding of emotions, and also in the research that we do and in the insights that we try to uncover, because the two go together. And look at this, it actually comes from a very different source. I was watching this series a few years ago, and it was at the very beginning in season 1 that this useful quote was actually shared, was shown. So I was watching this, I had to pause it to write it down, otherwise I would forget. But I thought it's an interesting quote, because again, it's about emotions, and it talks about decision-making and emotions. So this particular character in the series actually said, decisions based on emotion aren't decisions at all. They are instincts, which can be of value. The rational and the irrational complement each other, and individually they're far less powerful. So this is a quote which is about emotions. First of all, the comment is on emotions and decision making, as I have already said, but there is a very important distinction that is made here, the one between what is rational and what is irrational, and where exactly emotions come in. This is another really useful source. It's fairly recent. So the book that you see on the right was published in 2017. It actually gives us information about how emotions function in the brain. So what exactly happens there, how again emotions are connected with thinking, and what exactly is happening in our brain when we are experiencing different emotions. You see some words on the left, like some, again, a description of emotions, which is quite nice. And it actually comes from this particular source. So the author, Lisa Feldman Barrett, says that emotions do not live in a distinct part of the brain and are not universally expressed and recognized. They are constructed in the moment by core systems that interact across the whole brain, aided by a lifetime of learning. And I think that the last bit, aided by a lifetime of learning, is actually very important, because what it shows to us is that we keep experiencing emotions as we go along throughout our lifetimes, throughout our lifespan, and the way we actually understand those emotions, the way we construct them, the way we possibly regulate them and manage them is influenced by our experiences, by our backgrounds, by what is happening in life, and by how much we learn throughout our lifespans. And this is an important point to keep in mind. Perhaps one thing that I would kind of disagree, but not fully, not totally disagree, is that they are not universally expressed. I think that there are many cases in which, irrespective of culture, age, gender, backgrounds, there are certain emotions that we tend to express in pretty much the same way. And the last quote that I want to share with you comes from one of the participants in one of my research studies. And I am using this particular quote out of so many that I have and I could use, because this person actually said something without being necessarily asked about it. This person, this teacher, said something that I totally agree with. It was part of a project, an interview-based project, interview-based phase of that study, in which myself and my co-author, co-researcher interviewed teachers, English teachers in different contexts. So this quote comes from an English teacher who works at a university in the UK. So we interviewed them, and the focus of the interview was to talk to them about emotions they experience while they are teaching English in the classroom and what they do about those emotions, whether they are using any particular strategies for regulating those emotions. And as the interview conversation was developing, this teacher actually said what you see on the screen. People talk about being professional as not containing any emotion at all, as if the two are separate. Being able not to rush things, but hold back, step back, look at things more objectively is very important. But I would not like to be without emotion because I think it makes me who I am. And what this teacher actually said is very true. In different conceptualizations of professionalism, of what it means to be professional in what we do, in decision-making, in leadership, in management, and so on, emotion seems to be taken out, to be left out. And what this teacher actually said is nice. And I also like the last part, the very last sentence, where the teacher says that they wouldn't like to be without emotion because it makes them who they are. And we see here a strong link between emotion and identity. Okay, now I start with the first part of the plenary, which is the reflections bit. And I have included here two statements and a quote. Let's put it this way. So there are two statements on the top, okay, and followed by a quote, which is again useful for us to think about the role of emotions, of teacher emotions in this case. I will go through them, and then on the next slide, I have included the same statements and quote with some of my thinking in brackets, which I would like to share with you. So the first statement is that teachers engage emotionally with what is happening in class. And the second one states that teachers should be able to read their students' emotions. You see that read is in inverted commas, and basically what I mean here is that teachers are the ones, they should be able to understand their students' emotions and then possibly act accordingly. And the third one comes from a source in general education by Eisenbarger and Zambilas, who have done, especially the second author, Zambilas, has done important work on teacher emotions. Zambilas has worked mainly with science teachers in the primary and secondary level, in primary and secondary schools. So they suggest that teachers are expected to be exemplary in controlling their negative emotions. For example, their anger and frustration, in their desire to be better teachers and only display the positive emotions associated with caring. Now, let's see some of my thinking about those statements and the quote. For the first one, that teachers engage emotionally with what is happening in class, is it true? I don't know what you think. I will just leave this statement with you so that you can think about it while we are having this plenary together. So does this really happen? Does it not happen? Or is it a question of maybe, it depends? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they like to be detached, maybe. Depending on the situation, depending on what is happening in class. Now, the second one, teachers should be able to read their students' emotions. To what extent is this easy or difficult? And it is a question that we have asked the teachers as part of the interview-based study I mentioned earlier and a couple of other follow-up studies. And there is also a kind of warning here, which I think that language teaching methodology experts always highlight, is that we shouldn't should teachers. In other words, we shouldn't really always tell them what to do. And I think that reading someone's emotions is a difficult task. unless we have been with the same students for a large number of years, which doesn't really happen at university level. It normally happens in with lower level students, or maybe with younger students, for example, in primary school. And now for the last one, for the quote by Eisenberger and Zembilas, I thought that, okay, fine. They are expected to be, teachers are expected to be exemplary in controlling their negative emotions, and they are expected also to show their positive emotions, which is fine. But what could the possible repercussions of this be? What consequences could this have on the teachers, on their teaching, perhaps on their learners? So if we let's say, agree with this quote, if we think that, yeah, it makes sense, and actually it happens on many occasions, then we need to think of what the consequences of this could be on different aspects of what teachers do, and also on different aspects of what learners do, because the emotions of teachers aren't there just for them. They aren't there just for the teachers to experience, to express, to control. They also influence students in different ways. And this also depends on the type of emotion that is experienced or expressed. So this is something that we definitely need to think about, who this influences, what it influences, and how. Okay, so before I move on to what we already know about language teacher emotions, I would like to share with you what teacher expertise actually includes. And this is according to Underhill. So when I first read that, I thought, oh, that's interesting, because actually Underhill acknowledges the importance of psychology and, to a certain extent, emotions when talking about teacher expertise, when describing teacher expertise. So according to Underhill, teacher expertise includes 3 components. The first one is knowledge of the topic, followed by skill with classroom methods and classroom management, which in other words refers to the actual process of teaching, the actual teaching practice. And third, competence with interpersonal and intrapersonal relationships. And I think it's the last part that actually reflects classroom psychology, which includes emotions, learner emotions and teacher emotions. So this competence with interpersonal, intrapersonal relationships is actually important, and it is related with what I will be talking about today. Right, so what we already know, I have divided this information across a number of slides, and I have tried to also divide this information into groups. Right, so the first thing that I would like to start with is that the knowledge that we have about language learner psychology, including emotions, versus the knowledge we have on language teacher psychology and emotions is actually disproportionate in a way. So in other words, we know more about how language learners feel, think, and act in classrooms, as opposed to how language teachers think and feel in classes. And there was a quote that was produced, a short article, let's say, a short publication in the IATF conference selections many years ago in 2000 by Grundy, saying that within the language teaching profession, there is a tendency to focus on affect as though it relates only to learners. And perhaps we could slightly change this now, because we are 21 years after this quote has been produced, that there probably used to be a tendency to focus on affect as though it relates only to learners. There is interest in recent years, I would say in the last 5 years or so, during which we have seen a number of publications on language teacher psychology and emotions. So there is an interest in this area now, but still we don't know as much as we already know about language learners. There is hope. There is hope that we will know more about language teacher psychology and language teacher emotions through the research that I have just mentioned, the very recent research that I have just mentioned, and the steps that are being taken to look at different aspects of language teachers psychology through research, through teachers sharing their own ideas, their own practices, which are related with psychology and emotions, in teacher conferences, as part of action research projects, and etc. So we know some things about the specific emotions or specific emotional experiences, and I wanted to group these together. I hope I haven't left anything out, and you will see on this slide and also on the slides that follow that many of the references that I am citing are very recent, and this is related to what I have just said, that there is indeed hope and there is interest in this area in the last 5 years or so. So we know some things already about anxiety, about language teacher anxiety, which mainly comes from the work of Elaine Horwich, who was a pioneer in language learner anxiety research, but also her research has been taken forward by other teams of researchers as well, such as Ikeda et al. From Kansai University. The earlier research on language teacher anxiety has mainly focused on how non-native language teachers experience anxiety, what the causes of anxiety in this case are, and in most cases the causes of anxiety were related with language, with the fact that the language they were teaching was not at the same time their first language or their native language. And what can be done about that? And more recent research is actually looking at anxiety in a different way, the distinction between native and non-native language teachers isn't made, and teachers are seen more collectively. The anxiety of teachers is actually researched in a more collective manner. There is also very recent research on stress. It has been linked with COVID as well. One of the publications that I am citing here by McIntyre and al. Is about stress during COVID, the stress that teachers, English language teachers in particular, have been experiencing during this period. We know a little bit about happiness, which is one of the positive emotions that you see here in this list. And there is also its work that we are currently doing. And also about caring, which in some emotion lists is listed as an emotion. And that is why I have included it here as well, that caring is actually an emotion. And we know some things about caring, especially when it comes to cases where teachers work with highly anxious students. To what extent do they care in this case, and how do they actually perform caring with this particular group of learners? And the last point that I have included here, which I do not necessarily see as an emotion, but rather an emotional experience, an emotional condition, is well-being. And well-being is a concept that has recently started to be discussed, and it includes emotions. It also includes other areas of the psychology of language learners and teachers, such as their motivation, some of their beliefs to some extent, as well as strategies that are related to affect that are put into practice in order to manage certain emotions. So this is what I have included here in terms of specific emotions. And I move on to the impact that some of these emotions might have on teachers. I start by looking at difficult moments and their impact on emotions and what is happening in class. So difficult moments can actually have two different types of impact. And I start with the fact that difficult moments in classroom during teaching can lead to unpleasant emotions and unpleasant situations. One thing that they can lead to is emotional labor. And I will talk about emotional labor in more detail in a while, but very briefly, it refers to when we feel that we need to change our truly felt emotions in order to express, to show different emotions, because it is necessary, it is actually needed at that moment, because we think that it is necessary. Emotional labor can impact on individuals in different ways, but I will say more about that in a while. Another form of unpleasant emotion or unpleasant situation is burnout, which has been studied very briefly in our field in connection with emotional labor. And burnout refers to cases where we are exhausted in terms of work, mentally, psychologically, emotionally. We are exhausted and we might start showing absenteeism, not going to work, maybe needing some time off, which can happen. But the most negative consequences of burnout, the ones that are at the very negative extreme of the scale, are attrition, like quitting a job, quitting this particular job, and starting to think of doing something else. So emotional labor, which in some cases can lead to burnout, can actually have an impact on one's professional longevity and might also lead to attrition. So this is what I said, that I will say a little bit more about emotional labor in a moment. And one useful way to actually understand or define emotional labor is that teachers need to change. They need to edit out their truly felt emotions in order to project the organizationally desired ones. So, and I wouldn't limit this just to the emotions that are required by one's organization, institution, but also by what is happening in the classroom in a particular moment. In the classroom, a difficult situation might be going on. It doesn't necessarily have to do with how the teacher feels at that moment, but it might be related with what the students are doing, or what the students are saying, or how the students are interacting with each other, which can actually generate a set of emotions in the students and in the teacher. And these emotions, we need to think carefully of whether we should actually show these emotions or hide them. And this is what emotional labor is all about. We feel the need to actually not show some of the emotions that we are experiencing, because we are evaluating the impact of these emotions on ourselves as teachers and also on our students. And if we evaluate the impact and decide that the impact is going to be negative, then we would decide not to show these particular emotions and show something else, show a different emotion. The impact of emotional labor can be of two different types. Earlier research into emotional labor, which actually comes from the field of sociology, has actually shown that it's negative. The impact is negative because the more we labor emotionally, the more close we get to losing our true self. And this is because we are not showing our true emotions, but we are projecting emotions that we do not actually feel. More recent research, and actually research that comes from our field, the field of language learning and teaching, has shown that emotional labor can have a more positive impact. And in fact, there are many cases in which emotional labor in the classroom is actually necessary because it is good for both students and teachers. When teachers decide to not show a particular emotion because they have evaluated it as negative, they do not just do it for themselves. They do not just do it for themselves to feel better, but they are also doing it for their students because they think that by showing this particular emotion, they are not going to influence students in a nice way, in a positive way. The impact is going to be primarily negative. Now, what is interesting is that difficult moments in the classroom during teaching and even during learning do not always lead to unpleasant emotions and situations. There are cases in which, luckily, they lead to more pleasant emotions or situations. And one way this has actually been depicted in research in our area is through the concept of teacher immunity, which was introduced by Harber and Donnier in 2015. And what this concept actually suggests is that the more difficult moments or difficult experiences we actually go through, the more immune we might become towards those moments or situations. So this, in simple terms, makes us stronger. And when similar moments, similar emotions, similar situations come up in the future, we are probably, hopefully, better prepared to deal with them. This is also linked with resilience, in which case we have, in a way, we have a protective armor. We have generated like this protective armor, and we know how to overcome difficult situations, how to grow out stronger, how to grow stronger out of difficult situations. Difficult moments can lead to pleasant emotions or situations when these are related with emotion regulation. And actually, these difficult moments put us in a position to find ways to regulate our emotions. There is work by Morris and King with language teachers in Japanese universities, in fact, in which they have looked at specific at some specific emotions and how this can be regulated. The focus has mainly been on emotion regulation strategies that these teachers actually use. And a final point with relation to how difficult can actually lead to pleasant emotions or situations is that teachers can actually become more creative. They learn how to become more flexible, and they also learn how to generate change. And this last point is connected with all of the three examples that I have just given: immunity, resilience, and effective emotion regulation. Now let's move on to the other side of the coin. What we still don't know about language teacher emotions. And as I said at the very beginning, don't take this as we don't know anything about the points that you see here and on the next screen. We know a little bit, but it would be important to actually learn more, because I feel that there are still gaps in knowledge with relation to these particular areas. Now, the first thing that I was thinking about is that there are so many other emotions that haven't yet been studied. And it would be interesting to know how these emotions function, how they manifest in classrooms with different teachers. So if we are to study the full spectrum of emotions, if we want to actually consider the full spectrum of emotions, both in research, but also in our practice, then we need to shift attention to understudied emotions. And I have included in brackets some understudied emotions with relation to language teachers, such as disappointment, disillusion, pride, enthusiasm. So you see two primarily negative emotions, two primarily positive emotions here. So I think that overall it is important to actually shift our attention to those emotions that haven't yet been studied with language teachers. Another thing that I have been thinking about for a long time, but I haven't yet put into practice myself, so I haven't yet started investigating this, is the actual impact of language teacher emotions on language teacher practice. In the research on language learner emotions, the link between emotions and achievement has already been made. For example, in the research on language learner anxiety, researchers, especially in earlier research that has taken place in the late 80s and in the 90s, have looked at correlations between levels of anxiety and quality of performance or quality of learner achievement. And this was done by measuring the overall level of anxiety and also having an indication of students' performance, for example, their scores in a test, and correlating these numbers. And what most of this research had actually shown was that higher levels of anxiety reduce the quality of a student's performance in language learning. And lower levels of anxiety, on the other hand, would actually increase this performance. So lower levels of anxiety would help a student do better. We haven't done that with language teachers. At least I haven't come across any such studies. And I think that these quantitative measurements would be useful although they wouldn't solve all the problems, they wouldn't tell us everything that we need to know about the impact of language teacher emotions on practice. For this reason, it would be useful to think in terms of more longitudinal research, being with teachers for a longer period of time and talking to them, observing their practice, observing what's happening in classrooms, not just what teachers do, not just teacher practice, but also what learners do and how they respond to some of the teachers, some of the emotions that actually teachers show. So the impact on practice is not formally investigated through research projects, but anecdotally, we know that emotions that are classed as unpleasant or difficult or primarily negative also have a rather negative impact on practice. And then for positive emotions, we anecdotally again know the exact opposite, that if emotions that are experienced and expressed are primarily positive or pleasant, the impact on practice is going to be positive as well. But I feel that we need more concrete information, we need more detail about this kind of impact. Something else that we don't know much about is differences in the way emotions are experienced, expressed, and managed according to experience. I have included here like different groups of teachers, early career teachers, mid-career teachers, teachers that are in managerial positions, which means that they have been teaching for a longer period of time and they are now in that stage in which they have taken on managerial posts, leadership posts. And you might also come up with other groups of teachers that I haven't included here. But again, with relation to experience, we know from studies with general education teachers, and by this I mean not language teachers, that attrition normally happens within the first 5 years in teaching. We know, for example, from data that we have from the US and the UK, that come from teachers who are not language teachers, that once they enter the profession and they get a teaching job in a school, for example, it's usually within the first 5 years that these teachers experience difficulties, they are unsure about how to overcome them, and within these first 5 years, they decide to leave this particular job and do something else. So we already know that, it has been documented, but it would be interesting to see what happens with language teachers and what happens with language teachers in terms of different career stages. And the last thing that I was thinking about with relation to what we still don't know about language teacher emotions is what the special role of language is. The fact, in other words, that they are language teachers. Does this make any difference? There is already some research that I have briefly mentioned earlier on differences in anxiety within native English-speaking teachers and non-native English-speaking teachers. So we have some knowledge about that. But is there anything else that we can find out with relation to the role that language plays in this particular area, in how teachers experience emotions, how they manage emotions, how they even express emotions? You see that in terms of what we still don't know, all of the points that I have made are with question marks because we know a little bit, but these are questions that I feel are difficult to answer because we do not always have like concrete information, evidence about those. Now, in terms of new perspectives, which is the second focus of this year's conference, I have divided those into two areas: new perspectives in terms of teacher education and new perspectives in terms of research. I think the two are very closely linked, and I will show to you how. Within teacher education, it is important to include input on psychological aspects surrounding the foreign language learning and teaching experience. When I was doing my teacher training, I think that was probably 10 years ago, in our course, there was no input on how we as practicing teachers feel and how our learners feel when they are in this process of English language learning. There was only one session on motivation, which I remember back then I had found really useful, but there was nothing else. And anything else that we would learn in terms of how we feel and how our students felt was in one-to-one sessions or small group sessions with our teacher trainer. I have looked at the content of similar courses throughout the years, so that I'm not talking still about what was happening 10 years ago when I did my teacher training. So I was looking at the content of such courses, and the content is pretty much the same. It's still pretty much the same. And this means that no steps have yet been taken to actually include input on psychological aspects on such courses. And I am not saying that we should include input just on emotions, which is the focus of my talk, but I am talking here about psychological aspects more generally. We can include input on other aspects as well. Within teacher education, another new perspective or new direction that we could take is to offer training on emotional self-awareness and self-regulation. And by this, I mean direct, explicit training on how this can happen. Now, these are all new practices, and one reason perhaps why they are not included in teacher education yet is because they haven't been researched. They need to be, all of these new practices need to be empirically tested first, so that we get an idea, we know more about how well they could possibly work with practicing teachers, with trainee teachers, before we can fully incorporate them into teacher education programs. But I think that that would be a promising step. And this is how this is linked with research, that new perspectives we could take within research could actually help teacher education in the first place, and then teacher practice. Now, within research, we need to look at new constructs. And I have already mentioned, when I was talking about what we still don't know about teacher emotions, I mentioned some constructs that are missing from existing research. So we need to start introducing new constructs in the research that we do, and in the form of emotions that haven't, specific emotions that haven't been studied yet, specific ways of regulating emotions, specific ways in which emotions work with relation to one's experience and career stage, and so on. I also think that we need to start looking at new relationships. And by this, I mean new relationships between emotions, between emotions and practice, between emotions and years of experience, teaching experience, and so on and so forth. So these new relationships can actually shed light on how emotions function. In terms of new perspectives, it would also be worth considering new populations. And by this, I refer to new samples, different samples of participants, different participants actually, that we could focus on in our research. And I already mentioned, like, thinking of teachers in terms of the teaching experience that they actually have. So if we, let's say, take this as a starting point, we can come up with different groups of teachers which can actually form these new populations that I am thinking about here. And the last thing within research is to start considering new tools, new ways of doing the research, really, new tools or creative tools. And when I was writing this, I had in mind the doctoral work that Diane Armstrong has done with respect to the motivation of English language teachers in Spain. So what happened in this particular study is that the researcher has produced a questionnaire, a quantitative questionnaire, that would measure the participants' motivation to teach English. And the questionnaire in the pilot study didn't work at all, or didn't work well at all. So different items didn't load well. There were indications that the participants wouldn't really understand them, wouldn't really understand the differences across different items in the questionnaire. And there was just one section of the questionnaire in which the quantitative checks, the initial quantitative checks were good. So what this researcher did, because there were no other ways to actually salvage the questionnaire, was that she only used that section of the questionnaire in a purely qualitative doctoral study. So she used those items that actually loaded well in the pilot study, and she turned them into activities that she could use in the interview study. So the interview did not just include interview questions, which is basically what traditional interviews do, but she used a number of different prompts, and she encouraged teachers during the interview to work on a number of activities that were generated from those questionnaire items that had loaded well, those very few questionnaire items that had loaded well. And I think that this is a very useful way to actually create a new tool, a new interview guide, a more creative interview guide to engage participants even more to talk about aspects of their psychology. Right, so we have in a way made it towards the end, and I have included here some concluding remarks from what I have already discussed. Emotions are at the center of all human behavior, and as I have put in the abstract, teaching and learning are no exception to this, because emotions are at the heart of learning and teaching. And much of what we do in the classroom and much of what our students do in the classroom is actually guided or influenced by our emotions. It is important to attend to emotions alongside how we teach, and this is related with the points I have made on new perspectives within teacher education. I think teacher education has placed too much emphasis on the practical side, on the teaching methodologies, on materials and techniques, which are very important. And I don't mean to say that we shouldn't focus on those any longer. No, this is not what I have in mind. But what I am thinking is that alongside this very important dimension of teaching, we could also attend to emotions. And when it comes to this particular area, it is important to take stock of what we already know, which is part of the reflections that I have shared with you, but also to start making new suggestions and to think of new directions and new perspectives in order to be able to move the field forward. It is a fairly new field, judging from when all research and publications have been out, and I think it is a promising field through which we can learn a lot more about how teachers feel and think and behave in classrooms. I would like to thank you very much for listening to this plenary. I have included my email address here, so feel free to get in touch with me anytime in case you have questions or would like me to share materials that I have with you, or even just to say hi, that you attended this plenary and share any experiences and thoughts that you have about this particular topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your wonderful talk on emotions.
Thank you.
I really appreciated how you connected it so closely with the conference theme, with reflections and new perspectives. So thank you very much for all of that to think about.
Thank you. I see comments in the chat. I haven't opened it yet. Shall I stop sharing my screen so that I can, yeah? So
yeah, you can stop sharing your screen there. We do have a question. I think we have a bit of time for questions. First we'll do the raised hand, and then we'll see if there's anything in the Q&A. So once again, if you have any Q&A, please put them in below. Otherwise, you can do it at the end of this meeting there. So I got Berlin. Let me get Berlin on here.
There are some interesting points in the chat as well. So I'm
yes.
just quickly now, I'm scrolling up and down.
A lot of thank yous.
Yes, yes. Before the thank you notes, there are a couple of interesting points. I think these were probably made at the start of the presentation.
Okay.
Maybe I can read out a couple of those.
Sure.
It's much difficult to read the emotions of students who are wearing masks. That's very true. It's a new reality, isn't it? And I think this is probably linked with a couple of other points that are made later on. If we never express negative anger, it gives a pass to negative behaviors by learners. And that's very true. And I think that this is linked with the point that was made earlier, that emotional labor sometimes is necessary, but some other times we don't, let's say, have to perform it. And I was thinking about anger as well. And anger can actually be caused by a particular behavior by a learner. One example that I could give in this case is, let's say we have a student who keeps failing to return homework to us, to submit homework to us. I think that most teachers wouldn't get angry the first time. They probably wouldn't get angry the second time. They would think that, okay, this student might not have had time, they might be going through something else, and for this reason they couldn't complete the homework. Some teachers might want to find out whether something else is happening, and this is the reason why the student fails to submit the homework. But if a teacher realizes it's just a matter of negligence, for instance, then it might be useful for the teacher to actually express a somewhat negative emotion. It doesn't necessarily have to be anger, but maybe show their frustration or maybe show their disappointment, so that the student understands that this is not a useful way to learn. By showing this behavior, by doing this, by not doing the homework, then they probably won't improve. So I guess this is one example which is related to what Mark Jones has put in the chat, in which case emotional labor might not be useful. We may want to show our true emotion or emotions after a certain period of time, once we have evaluated the situation as well.
All right, thank you. Let's see here. If you click on the, there's a question. Actually, I'll read it out loud for you. There's a Q&A question from Amanda Yoshida, and she asked, has it been challenging to get published on this topic since it is not about language acquisition?
I like this question, actually. Thank you, Amanda. I wouldn't say it has been challenging. It is just that, yeah, I agree, it is not about language acquisition. When we are researching psychology and emotions, something that many people have been telling me all the time is that, for example, quantitative studies or even project proposals for funding for research projects are going to be, the chances are going to be higher for those proposals to be successful and to get the funding if, for example, we do quantitative research. And I think that when we are focusing on psychology, on the emotions in particular, we need to know more about how individual people feel. And in order to achieve that, we would most likely go for qualitative research. I am not favoring one or favoritizing one over the other, but I think that that has probably been my main challenge, because I am taking a more qualitative approach to this topic, which actually requires that we focus on individual participants and we try to analyze what individual participants have said and also how they think and understand and explain situations. I think that has been the main challenge for me, that when I am writing up something on this particular topic, which mainly adopts this kind of approach and doesn't focus on correlations, on relationships, which also gives us insights into this area. But I personally think that having the chance to talk to individual people helps me to learn more. The challenge for me has actually been to think of how to write this up, how to put everything together in a way that makes sense, in a way that helps us to learn something from it. So I would say in terms of getting published on this topic, that has been the main challenge, not necessarily that the topic is not of interest, of relevance, or anything like that. And also, it's a new area that people do not yet know so well. It is not as language acquisition, which has been so widely known and cited and so on. So it is a new area, and there might be some like skepticism, some caution about it now, but as I have said before, I think there is hope in terms of different things which are associated with language teacher emotions. And perhaps I could link this to a question that Jim Ronald has put in the chat. Hi, Jim. We have worked together before for the Learner Development Journal of JALT, and so it is really nice to see you here as well. What do you imagine could be included in teacher education? This is a great question as well. What comes to mind to me is the development of resilience or building a support network. This is probably my next step, I would say. I have been thinking about teacher education for a long time, and I haven't yet had the time to work on this particular area, because I really think that in teacher education, we should start incorporating new topics. So what I imagine could be included in teacher education is input in the first place, but which would help to raise practicing teachers' awareness of some aspects of their psychology or the psychology of their language learners. But I think that input is not always enough. It needs to be put into practice somehow. And that is why some more explicit training on how some strategies could be used, on how we can learn more about ourselves, how we can be more self-aware, should be part of that as well. I haven't tried anything yet, so these are just some ideas I have, but this is something that I would like to put into practice very soon.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for that comment there. I think we're just about out of time. So let me pull AD up here.
I'm here.
All right, we are just about done.
All right, so I would like to ask everyone one more time to thank Christina, Dr. Christina Gkonou, I should actually use your formal title, for your wonderful presentation, and also to plug her workshop this evening. She'll be giving a workshop in about an hour or so as well. So if anyone is around, please join her for her workshop. And Wayne will probably—
Very much, everyone. Thank you.